Hey Rihanna, hey Bruce, hey Arnold. Good to see you guys. Thank you for the like. Um, so this is just a recap. So before we get into the major profits, right? Because there's a lot of events that are taking place, right? And we've kind of read past them. So it's just a recap on some of the events that the major prophets are referring to, so you don't get like really confused, because we have read it already, but you know, it's just to refresh your memory to why the kings of Judah specifically um, were doing evil, and why God had exiled them. And it's just a little bit more of like an understanding of God's wrath, I guess, right? So I'm just doing like a recap in some books. So we're gonna read like a chapter in Joshua, then we're gonna move on to Samuel's, I believe, right? We're gonna move on to Samuel's. Hey Bruce, we didn't abandon you. You had a quick getaway, right? Well, to be fair, This live wasn't planned. Um, but I do think it's good to have like a refresh and a little bit of a recap of what we've read so far, because the major prophets pack you with so much stuff, and going back to so much events. You know, we're going back into Samuel's, we're going back into Deuteronomy, that we're going way back into the beginning, so you may have forgotten some events, or you may not be too familiar with some events. So um, I'm just really going over that before we get into the major topics. Um, so I'm going to start off with Shiloh. So I was on yesterday, right? So yesterday, when we was reading Jeremiah, right, it did refer back to Shiloh, right? And I just wanted to go over what was Shiloh, why did Jeremiah refer, or why did the Lord refer back to Shiloh as the example of what Jerusalem was going to turn out to be, coming to their exile, right? So it's just good to know this stuff, so you just know how deep their sin was, how merciful and patient God was with the Israelites, right? It's just to show you that, you know, he's not a mean God, he's a loving God, and God was very, very, very patient with the Israelites, right? He was very patient. Hey twins, thank you for coming through. I know, I had to go to town and get some things done. It's all good. Yeah, Bruce, you left abruptly, you know. It's like 1 minute you're there and the next minute you're gone. I'm like, okay. No chance to say bye or anything. Okay. um, so yeah, we are going to be talking about Shiloh. I think I'm pronouncing it right anyway. So Shiloh was the home of the tabernacle and the ark, right? Hello, it wasn't. Uh, thanks for watching. Bye. I didn't even get a chance to say bye. Maybe it's just how God is good. You feel me? You feel me? You heard? um, yeah. Uh, it didn't even give me a chance to say bye. So maybe maybe it's YouTube that just cut off abruptly. But yeah, I didn't get a chance to say like bye or anything. Um, but yeah, Shiloh was the home of the tabernacle and the ark, right? And it was also where Joshua casted the lots for the tribes, right? So Shiloh became the permanent place for the tabernacle, right? Because you remember the tabernacle was traveling with the Israelites, and they had to keep setting up the tent every time, right? And before they before Shiloh was decided that this is going to be the chosen place to set, they were moving around, right? So Shiloh was chosen because it sat right in the heart of Israel, right? It sat right in the heart of the land, and it was also easy for all the tribes to reach, right? It was also accessible to them, right? So, you know, God is good because he's thinking about all these things, right? He's thinking about how they can still seek him and still have a permanent place for the tabernacle and the ark, right? And it, you know, just to put it in context, it remained there for over 300 years before it was destroyed, right? And it was destroyed because of because of the Israelites' fault again, you know. So, you know, it sat north of Jerusalem on the hilltop of Samaria. So Samaria is what we call the northern kingdom, right? It's when it got divided. So, you know, and you know this was the spiritual capital for Israel, right? So at this point, Shiloh was the place where all the tribes came to pray. This was the permanent place. It sat there, and that was their temple, right? They no longer had to keep moving around in the wilderness, and you know, this was before the kingdom. We're gonna get onto why the kingdom was divided on Thursday, right? But this was before all the kingdoms were divided, right? They were actually all one. They were actually all united in one kingdom before it got divided, right? Which would have been about 120 years later before it got divided. And it had to be divided because it had to fulfill what God had said, right? So the lot was given to Ephraim, right? So Ephraim was kind of like, if you want to say, like the face of where the tabernacle and the ark was, right? It was very close to Ephraim. Hi Sai, thank you for coming through. And again, when we was reading Jeremiah, you see that God referred to Ephraim, right? It referred to Ephraim because they were like the face of the northern kingdom, right? But also they were quite near, when they were united, it was quite near to the tabernacle. It was on the northern side, right? Remember, after Solomon, there was a civil war. 10 tribes went north and 2 stayed in Jerusalem. Exactly, Bruce, right? So Judah and Benjamin were located on the south, right? So we're going to read it in a minute where they had divided, where their lots had been divided, right? So Judah and Benjamin were located on the south, right? But remember, all of their tribes got their own allotted spaces in their own little area, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that they were all united, right? And the Shiloh was the place where they went to being God's presence, right? It wasn't divided at this point. They were all united. They were all going to Shiloh. They were all going to the tabernacle where the ark was, right? So, you know, Ephraim was, you know, called the Northern Kingdom, which we know because it was divided, but it was also quite near to Shiloh, but it was also north of Jerusalem, right? So we know that Jerusalem's south, so that Ephraim was north, Shiloh was north, right? So yeah, I'll get into reading. Joshua because it kind of explains it. Right, so it says here, right? the land allotted to Ephraim and Manasseh, right? And Ephraim and Manasseh were children to Joseph, right? And if you remember, Judah, because we have to remember these are sons of Jacob, right? Even though they're tribes, they are sons of Jacob. We have to remember that Judah was the one that suggested to the brothers to sell Joseph into slavery, right? Judah said, let's do this, let's just sell him off, and the other brothers kind of went along with it. Reuben did try to intervene, but you know, and he was the oldest, by the way, so he did try to intervene, but you know, the rest said no, let Joseph go, right? So Ephraim and Manasseh are Joseph's children, right? And they got a blessing because of Reuben. And if you remember, Reuben slept with Jacob's concubine, and he basically lost his blessing as his birthright, right? He lost his birthright, he lost his blessing, and then it went to Joseph, and that's how Joseph, that's how Ephraim and Manasseh have got their tribe placed in the 12, right? So Ephraim and Manasseh are Joseph's children, right? But they got an allotted, they got an inheritance because Reuben was naughty, and he was the oldest, and he should have known better. So naughty Reuben, okay? So Judah suggested to sell Joseph into slavery, right? So I just want to put it into context. Judah and Ephraim have always had a problem with each other, right? Judah and Ephraim have not seen eye to eye, right? They've never seen eye to eye. So you know, the history goes far beyond just tribes. It goes beyond as brothers, right? It goes beyond as brothers. So once we can understand, you know, the sort of history between the brothers, we can kind of understand the history between the tribes, right? So it says here, right, land allotted to Ephraim and Manasseh. This is Joshua chapter 16. The land allotted to Joseph began at the Jordan east of the springs of Jericho and went up through the desert into the hill country of Bethel. It went on from Bethel, that is Luz, crossed over to the territory of the Arkites and Atharoth, descendants westward to the territory of the Jehaphlites, as far as the region of Lower Beth Horon and onto Gezer, ending at the Mediterranean Sea. So Manasseh and Ephraim, the descendants of Joseph, received their inheritance. This was the territory of Ephraim according to its clans. The boundary of their inheritance went from Atharoth Adar in the east of Upper Beth Horon and continued to the Mediterranean Sea. From Milcah-Mahath on the north, it curved east towards Tanath Shiloh, passing by to Genoa on the east. Then it went from Genoa to Ataroth and Nahara, touched Jericho, and came out at the Jordan. The land Joshua took back was far larger than it now. Right. From Tapua, the border went west to Kanaya Ravine and ended at the Mediterranean Sea. Now, some people say that Ephraim was on the west, right? Because it was west of the Jordan River, but it's actually north, right? So Ephraim is north. But some will say west because it was west of the Jordan River, and again, it was north of Jerusalem. This was the inheritance of the tribe of the Ephraimites according to its clan. It also included all the towns and their villages that were set aside for the Ephraimites within the inheritance of the Manassanites. They did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer. To this day, the Canaanites live among the people of Ephraim, but are required to do forced labor. Right, so they didn't get rid of they didn't get rid of some of the people in Canaan, right? In their inheritance, they didn't get rid. Some of them lived among Ephraim, right? Which, you know, it's kind of a tricky one, isn't it? Living with some of the people when you know that their ways are wicked. But you have to remember that Ephraim and Manasseh's mom was an Egyptian priest, right? She was an Egyptian priest, so she herself was a foreigner, right? She herself was a foreigner. So it's lucky that they even got their inheritance because of Joseph, or because of Reuben messing up, right? Which is that kind of explains where Ephraim was lotted, right? And why it's so important, and why it's like the face of the northern kingdom, right? But if we move on to chapter 18, it kind of tells us about a little bit about Shiloh, right? So this is the division of the rest of the land. Chapter 18. The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, right? So remember, the tent of meeting is where is the tabernacle. The tent of meeting is the tabernacle. Remember, they kept moving around. And when God said they need to pack it up and move here, they had to do it, right? But once they reached Shiloh, they didn't have to do that anymore, right? King Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, so was Paul. Yes, the country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not received their inheritance. So Joshua said to the Israelites, how long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you? Appoint 3 men from each tribe. I will send them out to make a survey of the land and to write a description of it according to the inheritance of each. Then they will return to me. You are to divide the land into 7 parts. Judah is to remain in its own territory on the south, and the tribes of Joseph in their territory on the north, right? So it's already telling us that Judah is going to be on the south, and the remaining tribes are going to be on the north, right? I think God made no mistakes. He always knew that Judah was going to be the line which was going to be for the Messiah, right? He specifically said it to remain on its own territory, right? In the south, right? And the rest on the south, and the tribes of Joseph in their territory on the north, which is Ephraim and Manasseh. After you have written descriptions of the 7 parts of the land, bring them here to me, and I will cast lots for you in the presence of the Lord our God. The Levites, however, do not get a portion among you, because the priestly service of the Lord is their inheritance, and Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to them. As the men started on their way to map out the land, Joshua instructed them, go and make a survey of the land and write a description of it, then return to me, and I will cast lots for you here in Shiloh in the presence of the Lord. So the men left and went through the land. They wrote its descriptions on a scroll, town by town, in 7 parts, and returned to Joshua in the camp at Shiloh. Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh in the presence of the Lord, and there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions. Amen. Judah's in Jerusalem. Right. So do you see why it's so important, why Shiloh was so important, and actually why God referred back to it in Jeremiah, right? Because one, it was resting place for the tabernacle and the ark, and 2 is where Joshua casted the lots for each tribe. So it's very like Shiloh played a very important place for the Israelites before the divisions of the kingdoms, right? So we get to actually see where each of them were placed, right? And why it was so important, why some places why some tribes were placed in some other places, right? And why Judah and Ephraim seem to be the tribe that seems to be mentioned most. Because remember, there are other tribes, right? And we have to remember the tribes are the children. The tribes are the children of Jacob. We have to remember they are brothers. Yeah, the tribes, but they are brothers, right? And yeah, we just have to remember that Judah and Ephraim had always had a problem, right? Judah and Joseph, right? If you want to put it that way, Judah and Joseph always had a problem, right? So it's kind of like amazing how God has pointed them out, Judah and Ephraim, to be kind of like the face of the kingdoms, you know. So it says here, land allotted to Benjamin. So Benjamin was the smallest tribe, and you have to remember Benjamin as a brother was the youngest, right? Smallest and the youngest, right? And they were quite close to Judah, where their lot was quite close to Judah, right? So the first lot came up for the tribe of Benjamin according to its clans. Their allotted territory lay between the tribes of Judah and Joseph, right? So Benjamin was sitting right in between Judah and Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, or just Ephraim if you want, because half the tribe of Manasseh was split, right? So Judah and Ephraim. So you have to remember Joseph was Ephraim and Manasseh's father. On the north side, their boundary began at the Jordan, past the northern slope of Jericho and headed west until the hill country, coming out at the wilderness of Beth Haven. From there it crossed to the south slope of Luz, that is Bethel, and went down to Atharoth Adar on the hill south of Lower Beth Horon. From the hill facing Beth Horon and on the south, the boundary turned south along the western side and came out of Kirith Baal, that is Kirith Jearim, a town of the people of Judah. This was the western side. The southern side began at the outskirts of Kirith Jearim on the west, and the boundary came out at the springs of the waters of Nephtoah. The boundary went down to the foot of the hill facing the valley of Beth Hannon, north of the valley of Rephaim. It continued down the Hinnom Valley along the southern slope of Jebusite city and so to En Rogel. It then curved north, went to En Shemesh, continued to Gilayoth, which faces the pass of Adonam, and ran down to the stone of Bohan, son of Reuben. It continued to the northern slope of Beth Arabah and down into the Arabah. It then went to the northern slope of Beth Hagloth and came out at the northern bay of the Dead Sea at the mouth of the Jordan in the south. This was the southern boundary. The Jordan formed the boundary on the eastern side, right? Beth Haran is where Paul, mom, and dad were taken from as slaves from to Rome, right? Oh, cool! I never knew that. Beth Haran. The Jordan formed the boundary on the eastern side. These were the boundaries that marked the inheritance of the clans of Benjamin on all sides. The tribe of Benjamin, according to its clans, had the following cities: Jericho, Ben Hagath, Emek Kezes, Beth Arabah, Zemarim, Bethel, Avim, Parah, Ophrah, Kepha, Ammoni, Ophni, and Geba, 12 towns and their villages. Gibeon, Ramah, Beeroth, Mizpah, Kira, Moza, Rekim, Rapel, Tarala, Selah, Helipah, the Jebusite city, that is Jerusalem, Gibeon and Kirith, 14 towns and their villages. This was the inheritance of Benjamin for its clan. Right? So we can see how much the Benjamites had. Hey Frankie Frog, thank you for coming through. So that was their lot. So, you know, they were really quite close to Jerusalem, because, it would kind of make sense why they would want to, when it got divided, that they would want to stay with Judah. One, because they were really, as I said, really close to Jerusalem. They were kind of in the middle of Judah and Ephraim, right? And they chose to go to, they chose to stay with Judah, it could have been one out of fear because they were quite close, and Judah could invade the Benjamites, right? Remember, they're a small tribe, they're very small, and it would make sense for them to try and have allies and try and team up with another tribe, right? So I guess they chose one to side with Judah, and two, was easy. It was also easy for the Levites to get to the temple as well. It's also easy for the Levites to get. So, I think they chose wise in siding with Judah. I think they chose very wise siding, but we get to see their demise, right? In the end, we get to see their demise, right? So that's we're going to talk a little bit more about Shiloh, but I really wanted to just show you the Judah, and I wanted you to see Ephraim, right? And I wanted you to see that there had been a history of them having problems, right? You have to remember they're brothers. They are tribes, but they are brothers, right? Just wanted to see that Shiloh was actually an important place because it was the first kind of place where the tabernacle and ark was set. Like, it was like the first spiritual religious ground where the temple was, right? So it was very important, Shiloh, right? It was very important, Shiloh. And as I said, the land, the Israelites got their inheritance, and yeah. We then see we're going to get into why now Shiloh was destroyed, right? We're going to get into why Shiloh was destroyed. They sided with Christ. Exactly. They decided to side with Christ. They said, you know what? We're going to go with Judah. We're not even going to entertain Samaria. We're not going to go down that road, right? We're going to stay with Judah. I think that was the best choice for them, right? And I think God made no mistake in giving them that lot that was so close to them anyway. It was close to Judah. It was closer to Judah than it was to Ephraim. So I guess God knew what he was doing. That's why I'm saying he makes no mistake. He knew what he was doing. He knew they were the smallest tribe, and he knew that Judah would just kind of take them under their wing, right? Even though we know Judah got a little bit, corrupt, but Judah, just kind of took me too. I think it was the best choice as well. Exactly, best choice for the Benjamites to side with Judah. So we're going to move into Samuel's, but it's always good to It's always good to go back and go back into the book of Joshua and just for yourself go and read, because um, that's where you'll find out their inheritance, their law, and it's basically the start of the Israelites' journey in having that relationship with God, right? They no longer have to travel with the tabernacle. They're in a place now where the tabernacle, the temple is permanent, and they can go to and fro and be in the presence. Remember, at this point, they are all united. There is no northern kingdom or southern kingdom. There is no Samaria and Judah, right? They are all one. They are all under one king, right? They're all under one king, right? I remember that they got divided after Solomon died, right? So they had one king. They had King Saul. They had King David. They had King Solomon, right? They were all under one king, right? It's only after Solomon died is when the kingdoms divided and had their own kind of way of working, right? So a couple of events that happened in Shiloh. If you remember in Samuel's Hannah's prayer, right? Hannah's prayer where she goes and prays because she wants a child. She's been trying and trying and she couldn't get a child, right? And she goes and she prays. She goes to Shiloh. She goes and prays and she asks God, please give me, a child. And then she is blessed with Samuel. I remember Samuel is dedicated to the Lord. Hannah said, if you bless me with a child, I will dedicate him to you, right? And that's exactly what happened, right? So I don't know if I'm going to read I guess we can kind of go over it again. So this is just to refresh your memory. So this is the birth of Samuel. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Surith, an Ephraimite, who had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord. Her rival provoked her till she wept and could not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorstep of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I shall give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Remember, the Levites didn't get a piece of the land. They inherited the temple. They got the tithes and offerings, and they stayed there at the temple. Exactly, right? So, Samuel, I think it's called a Nazarite. A Nazarite? I think that's what it is. So Samuel had been dedicated to the Lord, right? Just like Samson. Remember Samson? he was dedicated to the Lord, and he got his strength through through God, right? And remember, he gave up his secret to his strength, right? And as it says here, no razor should be ever used on his head. Now, because Samson gave up his secret as to why he could get his powers to Delilah, right? Remember, she shaved his head with a razor, and he was not to do that, otherwise God would have depart from him, right? God, that he would no longer have the strength of God, right? So this is what he's saying here: no razor will ever be used on his head. So it can't be, because he's been dedicated to the Lord, and it's through God's strength that everything that Samuel gets is through God, right? Just like everything Samson got was through God. He got his strength because he was dedicated to the Lord from birth, right? From birth. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying out here of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and they went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. Right? So Samuel was dedicated to the Lord, right? So again, I'm just trying to give you a bigger picture of why it was important, and why Shiloh was important, right? And why God was making an example out of Shiloh, right? So we've seen that the lots had been given to each of the tribes in Joshua, and we've seen that now Hannah gets her fulfillment of her prayer, which is Samson, right? And now I'm just going to go into the downfall. I'm going to go into the downfall of why Shiloh was made an example, right? So we're in First Samuel's chapter 4. But prior to this, I just want to let you know that if you remember Eli was the one who took Samuel under his wing, and kind of like taught him the ways of how to be in the temple, right? So that was Eli's role. But then Eli had some sons, which was just mentioned, right? Who became actually quite wicked and quite evil and quite corrupt, right? And started to do the opposite of what Eli was doing, right? So this was now seeing the downfall. So it's like a repetitive pattern of the Israelites just keep doing wrong. So the Philistines capture the ark, right? Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord covenant from Shiloh. Right? So now the Israelites have taken the ark, the covenant, the ark, out of Shiloh, right? Remember, Shiloh, it was the place where the tabernacle was. Hi, Kate. Thank you for coming through. Where the tabernacle was and where the ark was. Shiloh was holy, right? It was the holy ground. It was the holy place, right? So now the Israelites, in their haste and in their foolishness, have now gone to get that ark and take it out of Shiloh, out of its holy place, right? Why would you do that? Why would you take the ark out of Shiloh, right? So bring the ark of the Lord covenant from Shiloh so that he may go with us and save us from the hands of the enemy, right? So this is their first mistake. They took the ark out of Shiloh because they thought it was their lucky charm. They was trying to use it as a way to get God to, like, force God to give them victory, right? So they thought, oh, let me take the covenant of the ark out. Let me take this sacred thing out that holds sacred thing out that holds the covenant, the commandments, and the staff, and Aaron's staff, and you know the manna, right? Let me go and take this ark out, and let me see if I can use it as this, like, would I say magic, like a genie? You know when you rub the lamp and then you request for what you want, right? I think that's what they were trying to use the ark for, to get force God's hand in delivering them from the Philistines, right? And again, that was their mistake. That was their mistake. You think God was happy that the ark was taken, the covenant of the ark was taken out of Shiloh, right? No, he wasn't. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. They should have known better, right? They should have known better not to take that ark out, right? But they took it out of the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle, temple, the permanent place was in Shiloh. So they went into the tabernacle and took that ark out. They took it out of Shiloh, right? They took it out of Shiloh and took it to their camp, right? Which is quite foolish of them to do. When the ark of the Lord covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, what's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp? When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of the God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Right? They died. And why did they die? Because it was said that they had to die because they were wicked, they were corrupt, right? It was prophesied that they were going to, that the house of Eli was going to end. There was going to be no more. It was going to stop at them, right? Because of their wicked ways, because they were corrupt, because they didn't follow their father Eli, right? They did everything opposite, right? So they died because it was prophesied that they were going to, because the house of Eli had to end, right? It had to end. That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching, because his heart feared for the ark of God. When the man entered the town and told what happened, the whole town set up a cry. You're welcome. Right? The whole town set up a cry because Eli knew how bad it was that the covenant of the ark was taken out of Shiloh. Right? He knew that it was really serious. It was a really serious offense to take that covenant of the ark out, right, of the tabernacle, and use it for their own personal gain, like God was just this magic genie that was just going to grant them every wish, right? They didn't realize how sacred the ark was because of their own selfish gain and for their own selfish needs. That they didn't treasure the holiness of the ark, right? So Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old and whose eyes had failed so that he could not see. He told Eli, "I have just come from the battle line. I fled it this very day." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, Israel fled before the Philistines and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of the God has been captured. Right? Not only have you taken the ark out of its sacred place, now it's in the hands of foreign people. It's in the hands of the Philistines, right? You've taken the ark, it was in a perfectly good and safe place. And you've taken it out of that safe place for now it to be in the hands of foreign people, right? Not good. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backwards off his chair by the side of the gate. He was so shocked. Right? When he heard that the ark is now in the hands of the enemy, he was so shocked. I guess he just knew how serious it was. He knew how bad the situation was. The ark is no longer in Shiloh. The ark is no longer in the tabernacle, and it's not in a sacred place anymore, and it's not in the hands of the Levites anymore. So, it's a whole mess. It's really a mess, right? It's really a mess. And you can understand why David fighted to get that ark back, right? And you can understand why he learned how to handle the ark properly, right? After God humbled him and told him, "This is how you handle me," right? You just don't, you can't just take the ark anyhow. You have to go and get a Levite, and they have to be sacred and consecrate themselves before you can take up the ark, right? His neck was broken and he died, for he was an old man and he was heavy. He had led Israel for 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the end of time delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of the God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pain. Right? As she was dying, the women attended her, said, Don't despair. You have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay attention. So do you realize that they all realized how bad the situation was, that it caused them to go into shock, that they were so shocked and mortified that the ark was no longer with them, that it sent them to their death. Right? It sent them to their death. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel." because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband, she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. Right? So much evil befell Eli's family. Right. So because of all of this, God said, you know what, Shiloh, you shall now be destroyed. You are going to be destroyed, Shiloh, because of your corruption, because of your evil, because the ark has gone, right? The ark has gone, and you didn't really cherish what was going on, right? So Shiloh was made an example, just like Sodom and Gomorrah was made an example of God's wrath, to show that you just cannot treat him anyhow, and you just cannot go on anyway and think that you're not going to get punished for what you have done, right? That God saw everything that they were doing, right? God saw everything that the Israelites were doing, and he had to punish them, right? He had to punish them and make them see that they were doing wrong, right? So when we go into the major prophets, you will understand why places like Shiloh get referred to, you know, just like when Sodom and Gomorrah gets referred to, we actually know why the downfall of those cities were, right? So now we also know the downfall of why Shiloh was destroyed, right? Why Shiloh was destroyed. One, because of the corruption of Eli's wicked sons, and two, because of Eli's wicked sons, and because of the corruption, and two, because of the ark, because the ark was taken out of Shiloh, right? And again, God had to make an example of, you know, to not mess with him. So I hope that helps a little bit, and I hope I haven't confused you too much, but I really wanted you to understand why Shiloh is referred to, why Shiloh was actually like important in terms of for the tabernacle, for the covenant of the ark, right? Because that's, you know, Hannah went to pray for Samuel, and actually we get to see the downfall of why Shiloh eventually came to their own judgment, and they had to be destroyed, right? So when we get into the major prophets and they start to refer, like this, as I said, this is just a recap, right? Because we've already read through this already. I'm just trying to get you to think and have a recap and remember these things for when we get into the major prophets, so that when I say things like, you know, Shiloh, when it refers back to Shiloh, or if it refers back to Eli, or if it refers back to Hannah's prayer, whatever it is, right, you understand like the sentiment of it. You understand why it's important, right? And you understand why God brought it up, right? In Jeremiah, especially when he was trying to explain to Jeremiah about the coming exile, right? The coming exile of the Israelites. So yeah, that's the end of Shiloh. So that's the recap of Shiloh. I may be back on Thursday to talk about why the kingdoms were divided, right, and into two, and how it got to that point. Again, it's very important. It's very important to know these things, because if I'm saying the Northern Kingdom or Southern Kingdom, you can understand what the Northern Kingdom is and what the Southern Kingdom is. But then you can also understand that prior to the two kingdoms divided, they were all one, and they were all unified, and they were all under one king before they got separated into two, right? So we kind of know a little bit of the history behind what had happened before, you know, the two kingdoms were rival together. And we have to remember they are tribes, but they're also brothers, and it goes back into the history of the brothers where they were back and forth with each other. So, you know, well, once we know this and we know how deep the history goes back, we can understand why these two tribes are at odds with each other, and how the two kingdoms came to divide and have their own separate systems. The North got lost in. Glad you're. Thank you. Right. So yeah, I'll be back tomorrow to do the next chapters of Proverbs. Right. Next chapters of Proverbs, and then, as I said, I might be back Thursday, and we can talk about the Northern and Southern Kingdom, and then next week I might do the kings of Judah, but I might just speak about some of the kings that were mentioned in the major prophets and also minor. I think the recaps are really good to have, because you'll be able to easily pinpoint it back when we're in the major prophets. Honestly, it will be such a help, you know, and you know, I don't have to keep explaining it when I'm, you know, reading the major prophets. But yeah, see you guys, and thank you all again. Bye.